Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our Channel Islands at War Week. And I've been looking forward to this one. I look forward to all my shows, but this one particularly because if you've been following World War II TV in the past, you know that when it comes to the occupation of countries in Europe, of course, the resistance is interesting. Of course, those who collaborate is interesting. But actually, I'm far more interested in that kind of big, massive group of people who just try and survive under often very trying conditions. And so the guest we have lined up today is going to be talking about the majority. Well, there'll be some of the darker side of things as well, but it's the majority of people who lived in Jersey and the Channel Islands and what they experienced during that time of occupation. So Duncan Barrett, my guest, has written several books, but the one we're particularly talking about is the one I've got in my hands here. It's When the Germans Came by Duncan Barrett, and I'm going to bring him in now. So folks, before I bring him in, if you're new to the channel, and I've got a few new people in because of the work I've been doing with Time Ghost, Indian Night, and Spartacus over there, welcome to the channel, and all the information you need is in the drop-down description on YouTube. Links to people's books, links to their websites, so on, so all that is down there. Do consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. Do always consider buying my guests' books to reward them for coming on my show, and do share what we're doing on social media. But I'm going to bring in Duncan now. So good evening, Duncan. How are you today?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good. So you heard my introduction there, and I think I've kind of covered a little bit about your approach to the Channel Islands. But before we get into that, I like in this often to get people to kind of describe where they sit themselves in the field of history, military history, social history. So Duncan, how would you describe yourself in terms of your writing about World War II?
That's a tricky one. I guess I tend to get put in the box of social history because I'm very interested in kind of ordinary people's experiences of war. I'm not much of a kind of military strategy geek. I'm not that good on the hardware. I kind of, I can bone up on these things a bit if I need to, but I'm much more interested in the kind of the ordinary experience. So I've written quite a lot about civilians in the war. And that's really one reason why I was very much drawn to the Channel Islands story. Is I think in some ways it's the ultimate home front story because it's the home front and yet the enemy are right there, and there are all these kind of complications and interesting questions. But there is also this civilian population, 70,000 people living through these tough years. I mean, we talk about the Blitz spirit. I kind of think they had some of that as well. They had their occupation spirit. They managed to get through a really tough time. And it's a story I think we don't really talk about enough. And because of those stories about, as you mentioned, collaboration, about these kind of questions about what happened there during the war, which the kind of post-war period, particularly, I think, Churchill had a very conflicted relationship with the Channel Islands. And the government kind of immediately after the war, I think, had this kind of idea there was something to be a little bit ashamed of. It was a story that wasn't much publicized during the war because they felt it was bad for morale. And so I think all of these kind of anxieties and sort of ambivalences about that story have meant that we haven't really been willing to talk about it enough and to look at it's not exactly the positives of the experience because it was not a positive experience, but to look at the whole breadth of that experience for the people who lived through it, not just those kind of shocking kind of outlier moments.
No, definitely. And I mean, it's intriguing to me, and we'll get into it in the presentation, is that when you're reading a book like yours, is that you're hearing stories that some of them are very similar to stories of the Londoners or Exeter or Plymouth. It's LCs and Bills dealing with rationing, dealing with hardships, things like that, digging up their gardens to provide vegetables. Then the other half of it is very much like reading about occupied France, occupied Norway, because as you said, you've got Germans marching up and down the streets, building constructions there. So it's got elements that are recognizable from other areas. There's like a Malta spirit in some, because islanders have that unique island outlook. So Jersey and Guernsey have that unique outlook on life generally. Then there's the kind of the home front bit. Then there's the fact there's Germans on your doorstep, and all that mixed in a very, very small space. Whether we're talking about Jersey or Guernsey or the smaller islands, they are very small places. So there are places in occupied Europe where you could be very, very distant from the occupier. You could be living in the middle of France or Norway and not see a German for weeks on end. But in Jersey and Guernsey, I'm guessing you couldn't really go more than a few hours almost without that presence being right there in your face because of the proximity of everybody. And when Phil yesterday showing us just how many fortifications there were around Jersey, I mean, incredible. So anyway, you've come armed with a PowerPoint, folks. We will do questions kind of as we go along. about the Channel Islands, about the civilian experience, about anything you want to ask, really. But I'm going to kind of do it in between a presentation and kind of the usual sort of jumping in with questions and comments. But I'll hand over to you, Duncan, and I will jump in when I feel it's appropriate.
Okay, so well, just to give a tiny bit of background in case people aren't kind of familiar with the story of how the Channel Islands came to be occupied, because this is sort of part of where some of those controversies about this story originate, I think. It was the 19th of June. It was less than a fortnight after Dunkirk. Winston Churchill, very new in the job, and at a meeting of the War Cabinet, he's brought this proposal by the kind of military chiefs that the Channel Islands, which, if you're not up on the geography, are British territory, but they're just off the coast of France. So geographically, they're much closer to France than they are to England, were essentially a waste of resources to defend. There was no way that, you know, if the Germans take the continent, there's no way that we're going to be able to protect these islands, and that really it's not worth trying. And with the loss of life, with the loss of materials, with the loss of armed forces personnel and so on. So this decision was taken very much against Churchill's better judgment. He described it as repugnant. You can go and look at the minutes of the meeting, to demilitarize the islands and basically pull all the troops out. They did this in quite a rushed way. And then there was this period of evacuations where people could leave voluntarily if they wanted to. A lot of people did leave, went and stayed in Britain. About 70,000 in total. The majority decided to stay and so they knew what they were getting themselves in for to some extent. They knew the Germans were coming. They didn't really know what to expect. They'd heard horrific rumors, as everyone had, about the Germans, you know, murdering babies and all this sort of thing. So there was a lot of kind of trepidation. But that was really, you know, as I said, what drew me to this topic was this idea of what was this experience like for the 70,000 people who lived with the enemy, literally, as you say, on their doorstep. You know, you couldn't avoid them. I mean, in the early weeks, you might, you know, not see a German for a few days, but as time went on, it was a ratio of something like 1 to 2 locals to Germans at one point, you know. So you really couldn't avoid them. They were kind of everywhere. So anyway, I got fascinated by this story about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, because I was talking to a friend at his birthday party, and he told me about his grandmother who came from Jersey. And he didn't even know entirely what the story was. But the thing that really caught my interest was something had happened to his grandmother in Jersey during the occupation that meant that his family had been kind of split down the middle, and they'd never, you know, this was, you know, what, 70 years on or something, it never recovered. It never kind of been pieced back together. And there was this, you know, as I say, this sense of shame, this sense of kind of, there's this kind of veil over those years. And it just really fascinated me, this idea of, you know, what could have gone on the kind of domestic level like that, on the level of an individual family, could cause such repercussions. So I went and I spent 3 months living in Guernsey. I brought my family over with me, my partner, my son, who was just turning 1 at the time, 2 dogs. We rented a place in Guernsey by the sea, which was gorgeous. And then I was kind of island hopping over to Jersey, over to the smaller islands, Sark, Alderney, Herm, and interviewing as many people as I could find who'd lived through those experiences. Many of them as children, given, you know, the amount of time that has passed, but some who were adults. I spoke to one woman who was, I think, 106. I think she might have been the oldest person I've ever interviewed. So yeah, I got a kind of smattering of different experiences, and then also obviously drawing on published memoirs, some unpublished memoirs that I managed to get hold of, other sources to try to fill in a little bit more of the kind of, you know, the older generation's experience, because obviously they were, you know, were long gone. So I was slightly hesitant going over there, because I know there has always been this element of kind of this worry about, particularly about outsiders coming to the islands and judging them or criticizing them for what they did or didn't do during the war. And I did have actually one quite funny experience with a woman who she was telling me about a story. It was her birthday. It was like her 7th birthday or something. And there were some Germans living in the house next door, and there was a German guy who had a daughter about her age who had become quite friendly with her. And he gave her this birthday. He gave her a birthday present. I think that he'd made some kind of wooden toy, but he also wrote. She had this autograph book, and he'd written her a kind of birthday message. And she got this thing out, and obviously I was fascinated because I was keen to look at any kind of, you know, memorabilia or kind of artifacts at the time. But she was really worried about it. And she said, I don't know if I should show you this. I don't want you to think I'm a collaborator. And I was like, you were 7 years old. This was, I don't know, but that kind of anxiety sort of remains for a lot of people. So I was worried going over there. Is everyone just going to clam up? Are people not going to be willing to talk to me? Now, in fact, pretty much everyone that I tried to talk to was more than happy to talk to me. These are
just to jump in with a question. You said 6 years ago. It's kind of, you couldn't have left it much later if you were going to wanted to speak to people who were there. But I wonder if you had done it too earlier, you wouldn't have got the same reaction, because obviously historiography, attitudes mellow with time. It's like, living in France as I do, the attitude to collaboration, resistance, occupation has changed over the decades when it's gone more distant. So perhaps if you'd gone to Jersey, obviously you weren't alive then in 1964 or 65, it might have been a different reaction than going, 2015, something like that. So do you think it was about the optimum time to go?
Sorry, I think we're getting a bit of gate crashing going on here. Yeah,
it's like one of those BBC ones when the kids come in. It's fantastic. We haven't had one of them. This is a potential viral moment now.
I know. Yeah, I think yes, that's probably true. Certainly, it's true. You can't leave these things that much later. All the books I've done, because I've done several books about World War II, and there's always a kind of race against time element. And, a lot of the people I interviewed for this book passed away before the book even went to press. And certainly in the years since it came out. I think that is an interesting question. Yes, that is probably true that the kind of attitude there has changed to some degree over the years. There's also an element on a more personal level. That one woman that I interviewed, so basically to try and find people to speak to, I put an ad in the local paper, I went on the local radio, I wrote an article for the local paper. I did everything I could to try and get the word out, essentially. And one woman that I interviewed, she said, I've been reading about you for, this was like about 2 months in or something. She said, I saw the ad in the paper and I tore it out and I put it on the fridge and it sat there for about a week. And then I thought, no, I don't want to do that. And then I, heard you on the radio and I wrote down the contact details. And then I decided, no, I didn't want to do that. And then after, eventually she'd come around to the idea of talking to me. And she said, I just felt like, there are the same people who always are interviewed for these things and who have been, like there was a kind of generation of people who were the spokespeople of the occupation somehow. And other people who lived through it sort of felt like, well, who am I to talk about my experiences, because there's this person who everyone always seems to want to talk to. And then she said those people have been dying off. And so she sort of felt like there was space almost for her to tell her story, which I thought was really interesting. So I guess you do, it is one benefit. Sometimes people say, well, what's the point of doing this story again? So-and-so wrote this book 20 years ago or whatever. I think you do always get different stories because you get different people who are willing to talk for whatever reason.
Yeah. And maybe you get the big stories first. Out of occupied Europe, you get the resistance fighters and then people writing the stories about the spies and the agents and all those kind of people. But actually, as we'll get into it, it's the ordinary people who are, as we said in the top of the show, they're just dealing with a different experience for several years and having to deal with food, having to deal with all those things there. Perhaps those people don't come forward first because they don't think their story is somehow dramatic enough because it doesn't involve the ditch pilot or Gestapo agent knocking on the door, whatever it would be, or deportations. But actually, as we're talking about, the experience of most people had that ordinary experience. And I'm not belittling the hardships, but I'm saying a less dramatic experience than those that had the big dramatic experience that the kind of things movies are made of. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole of historiography, but I'll hand it back to you to carry on with some of these people that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if I had £1 for every time someone says to me, oh, you don't want to interview me, I don't have anything interesting to say, I'd have made more money than I have from writing books, let's say.
Yeah. Well.
Having said that, some people do have astonishing stories. The first person I was going to talk about, the very first guy I interviewed actually in Guernsey was a man called Tony Hobbs. He phoned up the radio station while I was on the air because I was, trying to get the word out. And I chatted to him a bit on the air and then I went round to see him. And so I had a chat with him and he told me a bit of his family story. And he showed me these two photos that I put up on the screen, which are of his father and his grandfather. His father is Harold on the left and his grandfather Fred is on the right. and they both worked in the Guernsey lifeboat. And I don't know whether you covered this in the talks you've done before, but basically at the start, just before the occupation proper, there was this bombing raid on the capitals of Guernsey and Jersey, St Helier and St Peter Port, where the Germans sent, they had a term for it, they called it reconnaissance in force, which was a lovely euphemism, where they wanted to be sure that the British forces had been genuinely withdrawn, that the islands had genuinely been demilitarized. And so to establish that, they sent a load of planes in and bombed everything to smithereens and machine gunned people in the streets. And it was a pretty brutal, horrific experience in which 44 people were killed. I mean, nothing compared to the Blitz or, you know, some other experiences that we know of during the war, but quite horrific in these islands. And anyway, this guy, Tony, his father and his grandfather were both out in the Guernsey lifeboat at the time when this bombing raid happened. And the lifeboat itself came under attack. It was actually off the coast of Jersey, funnily enough, at the time, even though it was the Guernsey boat. And his grandfather, who was the coxswain of the lifeboat, who's the guy on the right, had to steer a zigzag course, basically, to try and avoid the machine guns of the planes that were coming after it. Beached the lifeboat, ended up on the sand just outside St Helier, capital of Jersey. Everyone scrambled out. They scrambled for cover, try and get behind a wall or get behind a rock or whatever. And it took a while before they realised that someone was missing. And it was Harold, this guy, Tony's father. They found him in the end lying in the boat with a bullet through his head. One of those kind of first casualties, really, of the occupation. And it was just very interesting. So Tony, who I spoke to, he was 4 at the time. He remembered this. I mean, I don't think he really fully understood what it meant at the time, you know, losing his dad like that. But he remembered going to see the a German admiral, German representative, a few days later, once the Germans had arrived and were kind of setting up their own, you know, kind of administration and so on. He and his mother went to see this admiral to try and get his father's body back for burial. And he said to me, his memory was just of this kind German man who was incredibly apologetic and basically said, look, this should never have happened. They shouldn't have fired on the lifeboat. I'm really sorry. And he said he remembered sitting on this admiral's lap, playing with his iron cross. So that was his first memory of a German, bizarrely. And he didn't, as a child, I don't think he associated with it. Oh, these people killed my dad. He just, I don't know, that was his memory. So it's interesting. I mean, what you want to make of that, who knows? But I suppose it goes to show on many levels the complexity that some of these stories have to them, and that it's not always as black and white as even someone whose father's just been killed, you might think would be the most likely to have a kind of black and white approach, but no.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, it's the complexity is the interesting thing. As we said, it's the reinforcing this idea that if you're on the Channel Islands, you experienced every aspect of the war. As I've said, repeating myself, you're in occupied Europe, you might be living near a U-boat pen, or you might be living in the countryside, but on the Channel Islands, you saw every aspect of it. You saw construction, you saw German troops, you had to deal with rationing, you had to deal with the authorities. So the experiences, and death is that, you know, that those raids, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to know someone who's has lost someone. You're going to know someone who's been evacuated. You're going to know someone who's going to be later deported. And so everybody's experience is encompassing all the aspects of occupied country. But anyway, I'll hand it back to you. This is really, I'm loving it. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so everyone I spoke to, one way or another, had some memory of this raid, because it was such a kind of traumatic experience for people. And even though the number of dead, as I say, was only in the 40s, it meant that everyone knew someone who'd been killed, someone who'd been injured, someone who'd lost someone. So it really, I think, left a kind of scar on the population. And aside from this idea of reconnaissance in force, it was a kind of shock and awe campaign. It meant that when the Germans arrived, you know, a day or two later, there was not going to be any resistance. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there were there were some weapons. There were, like, you know, shotguns and rifles. You know, people had some weapons, but basically there were no forces in the island. There was nothing to defend them, and these guys had proved that they could be pretty brutal. They could be pretty tough. So that was their kind of their sort of introduction to the Germans. Wow. And people I spoke to had these very evocative memories of because in Guernsey, the target of the German bombing, a lot of it was targeted on this row of lorries that were lined up by the harbour. And this was the time for the tomato harvest. Guernsey's a massive, or was in those days anyway, massive tomato exporter. And so all the lorries were filled with tomatoes that were ready for exporting to mainland Britain, and they were ready to load them up. Some people think the Germans mistook them for, thought they might be military, guns, weapons, who knows what. And so they bombed this kind of row of lorries. The lorry drivers were all, hiding under their cabs, trying to escape the bombing. And a lot of them died because their lorries just kind of went up in smoke. But one woman, I spoke to a woman called Nellie, who told me that she went to see the kind of aftermath afterwards. And she just painted this amazing picture of this, this scene of complete devastation, but also all these burnt tomatoes everywhere. There was this kind of mixture of red pulp all over the place. No one knew, was it blood? Was it tomato juice? What was it that was covering the floor? But she said there were also just these kind of husks of these burnt tomatoes, these black round, tomatoes burnt to a cinder. She said it was like roast chestnuts everywhere. So it's just these kind of memories like that I suppose you only get from the personal experience of kind of, the ordinary person on the scene. Those were the kind of things that I was particularly keen to capture, I guess.
Brilliant.
These are some pictures of the damage to, you can see the one on the left is one of those lorries. You can see kind of what's left of it. The one on the right is the Weybridge clock by the harbour in Guernsey, also quite badly damaged. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of kind of the damage that the Germans wrought in that first attack. And in Jersey, I've never quite got to the bottom of this, but they took a different approach on the two main islands. In Guernsey, they kind of just walked straight in. In Jersey, they then dropped a kind of these sort of leaflets, basically demanding a show of surrender. And they wanted a surrender not just from the authorities, but they wanted a surrender from individual people. So it was almost like a kind of, people I spoke to, they said it was humiliating. It was almost like they were being personally asked to submit. And so what they said was that every house had to put out a white flag. And people told me the lengths they'd go to, most people don't have a white flag, so they were sticking sheets out the window. One woman said she found a pair of old knickers and put it on a broomstick, out the front door. So there was literally this weird collective experience of having to signal your surrender to the enemy, which for a lot of people was quite humiliating, really. But at the same time, that's almost the last thing on people's minds. They're worried about their safety. They're worried about what's gonna become of them.
Good stuff.
So then, in fact, what happened for a lot of people? So there was this expectation of kind of brutality from the Germans, but for most people, they found that they didn't really live up to that expectation. This is actually, this slide here is just to give you an idea. This was a white cross. I don't know if you can see it. It's quite hard to make it out in the black and white, but they painted a massive white cross in the town square in St. Helier in Jersey so that the Germans could see it from overhead. So that was another one of their kind of stipulations. What people didn't realize was that the Germans coming over to the Channel Islands, there were a lot of reasons why, once that bombing raid was out of the way, they were actually going to be on their best behavior. They were going to be, as one of the local leaders referred to it, as a model occupation. There was this idea from both sides that this was going to be as kind of gentle an occupation as you could possibly get, if you know what I mean. And from the German point of view, this was partly because they were aware that there was a kind of PR value in making it as non-brutal an experience as possible, because there was still the intention of taking mainland Britain at some point further on. And there was also, for the Germans, a sense they'd lucked out massively. If you got posted to the Channel Islands, there's no resistance, there's no fighting. They're beautiful, stunning islands. They arrived in the middle of summer. They basically arrived at a holiday resort. This guy, Werner Rang, was one of the few Germans that I managed to speak to. And the reason I managed to speak to him is he basically fell in love with the Channel Islands so much. He fell in love with a local girl as well, but I think he fell in love with the islands even more, to the extent that he made his life there. He decided to marry her and make his life there. I'm just going to have to deal with this dog. I'm really sorry.
No worries.
Give me a sec.
Folks, this is the perils of live TV. It's amazing, isn't it? But yeah, dogs and children. But yeah, and thanks everybody for watching, and thanks for your lovely comments about how much you're enjoying Channel Islands Week, because I'm glad we're covering it. It's been really cool to do, and Yeah. So and Nick is watching now. Who's going to be on tomorrow night, and it's interesting. Well, that this is touching on what Phil was saying yesterday about the Channel Islands being. Phil used an analogy. A show house on an estate of new houses that are being sold. It's kind of the model of the German occupation, just like the bunkers, Atlantic Wall was a model of how the Germans can do the very best in terms of their defenses. It's also, in this case, the model of how they can best occupy a country. So there's an interesting parallel there. So that's pretty cool. So brilliant. So Duncan's back.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I was just talking about the fact that the model occupation connecting with what Phil said yesterday about the Atlantic Wall being kind of a showcase for the best Atlantic Wall. They're using the Channel Islands as a very much a kind of a demonstration.
They were, absolutely. And Hitler was upset. I mean, I said Churchill had this issue with the Channel Islands. Hitler was obsessed with the Channel Islands. He loved the idea of the Channel Islands to a slightly bizarre extent. I mean, the Atlantic Wall was, on one level, a massive vanity project. They wasted huge amounts of resources building all of this. But anyway, I was just going to say about Werner Rang. He told me about coming over to Guernsey for the first time from France. He'd been in occupied France for a bit. And he said he just couldn't believe it. They took the boat over. There were dolphins accompanying them on the way over. He was just like, this is paradise, basically, I've arrived in. And he said they arrived at a hotel in St. Peter Port, capital of Guernsey, and immediately ordered a bottle of whiskey to toast the Fuhrer for sending them to this kind of gorgeous place. So that kind of gives you an idea of the good mood the Germans were in. They were on the beaches sunbathing, they were having ice creams, they were kind of making the most of it. They weren't in a mood to brutalize anyone, really, in those early days, at least.
Wow.
This is a guy, Roy Burton, who is a farmer who I interviewed. He was a child during the war, and he told me an interesting story, kind of along similar lines, about his father, who was the farmer at the time, and a guy called Franz Werner, who was one of the Germans who was stationed locally to his farm, and he'd been a farmer back home in Germany. The other thing I think to bear in mind about a lot of the German soldiers is many of them were conscripts. So this guy, Franz, was conscripted into the German army. He was not a card-carrying Nazi at all. He didn't particularly want to be fighting a war. And he was very keen to get to know the local farmer because he was a farmer and he sort of felt he wanted to relate to him as a fellow farmer rather than as an occupier or as, the enemy. And so this guy, Roy, told me this German guy turned up one day with a German-English dictionary clutched under his arm and tried to explain to the farmer's wife that he wanted to meet the farmer. And she was a bit shocked, but in the end she said, well, look, he's out birthing a calf in the barn. And so the German kind of wandered down there, saw what was going on, and immediately ripped off his tunic, rolled up his sleeves, and kind of got stuck in. And that gesture, I suppose, of being willing to help in that way really cemented this unlikely sort of friendship between these two farmers. And they chatted about their different experiences of farming methods in Guernsey and in Germany. So it kind of gives you another idea of how, for a lot of the Germans, there was this kind of desire to not be seen as the enemy, to not be seen in these kind of in this negative way, which, as we'll go on to talk about, wasn't always possible in the long run. But certainly in that kind of early period of the occupation, there was a kind of honeymoon period where everyone was really trying very, very hard to make it work. And this is one of the reasons that Churchill was quite down on the local authorities, that they were doing the same thing, really. And there's a guy who I'll talk about in a bit called Ambrose Sherwill, who was the Attorney General of Guernsey. The way he put it, in quite an unfortunate phrase, I think, was he said, our goal is to essentially run the occupation for them. So his idea was that by putting the kind of local administration almost in between the Germans and the people, in a way that did mean effectively doing what the Germans wanted, or kind of helping them to kind of administer things, that they could kind of protect the people. They were a kind of buffer for them. What this looked like from the outside to people in Britain, certainly to Churchill, was essentially collaboration on a kind of massive scale. It was kind of Vichy France scenario. I mean, Churchill is Sherwill is a divisive. Churchill's a divisive figure in the Channel Islands. Sherwill's a divisive figure in the Channel Islands and anywhere. My kind of sense, the more I looked into him, was that his intentions were good. He was just politically quite naive, and actually the Germans were quite canny and quite savvy, and often ended up sort of outwitting him. And he would try to do something that he thought was was a good idea, and without realizing the massive PR coup he'd been handing them, or so there were these various examples where he made really quite bad political decisions, but not for bad motives. Essentially, he was inexperienced politically. He wasn't really up to the challenge of dealing with these Germans who came in and often were quite kind of shrewd and knew what they were doing and knew how to kind of play this game.
It's that eternal question. You get it like with the prisoner of war camps, isn't it? Is if does the senior British officer or American officer parade his troops because the Germans want it to? Is he doing it because the Germans want it to, or is he doing it to maintain the semblance of control of his and leadership of his own people? And you can, in those situations, I can see it from both points of view completely. And as people are saying in the comments there, what else was there? Were no other options anyway. The Germans are on the island; they can't escape now. So you've got to deal with the situation. But it's that complexity of when Chris Millington was on the show talking about resistance, collaboration, and he preferred the word defiance and accommodation. And these words like collaborator are very, very loaded with emotion. So someone who is essentially agreeing with what the Germans want and is helping to facilitate their organization. Is it collaboration, or is it trying to improve the lot of the people in the island? These are rhetorical questions I'm not expecting answers to because they're very complicated. But I'm glad you're attempting to answer them, even though they are essentially impossible to answer.
Well, and people were asking these questions at the time as well. I mean, I interviewed a guy in Jersey who actually, to the extent that there was any kind of resistance, there was no there was no equivalent of the French resistance, partly because there were no weapons, there was nowhere to hide. The French resistance, they could go into the mountains, they could kind of go to ground. These islands, too small, there's nowhere, you couldn't really hide from the Germans. There were the level of kind of what you might call there were people who didn't do as they were told. And if you heard a little bit earlier in the week about the slave workers who were really appallingly, if the locals were treated well, the slave workers were a different kettle of fish. They were treated appallingly badly by the Germans. And some people did risk their lives to shelter slave workers, to hide them in their barns, to try and feed them, look after them, and so on. So to the extent that there was any kind of resistance network, it was a sort of humanitarian resistance network, really. It was people who were involved in, hiding these people, moving them around, protecting them in various ways. And one of the people that I interviewed was an amazing guy called Bob LeSueur in Jersey, who was involved in this kind of resistance network, basically, and helped, I think, about a dozen escaped Russian slave workers who were, at risk of being recaptured and punished by the Germans. But he told me quite an interesting story right at the beginning of the occupation, before he got involved in this kind of murky world of humanitarian resistance. He said both he and his mum had these kind of experiences when they first encountered, and he was like 17 or 18 or something at the time. It's the other thing. He was a very young man. When the Germans first arrived, he said a German asked him for directions one day, and without thinking, he told him where the place was that he wanted to go to. And then afterwards, he was sort of agonizing over it and thinking to himself, should I have sent him the wrong way? And he said, should I have sent him up a hill in the opposite direction to kind of maximize inconvenience to this German? And then in the end, he sort of thought, well, what's the point? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so trivial. It's like, I don't know what difference it makes. But he was questioning it. His mother similarly was on a bus, and a young German man offered her his seat. She was an older woman, and she was in this kind of paroxysm of, what do I do? Everyone on the bus was staring at her. She was like, do I accept do I accept the seat from the German? Or is that collaboration? Is that fraternization? Or, do I refuse the seat? And he said she was sort of thinking, well, he's obviously been brought up well. It's a polite thing to offer an older woman your seat. It seems wrong to say no. So, whatever you did, to some extent, you were kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. There was no right answer to these questions, but people were agonizing over them constantly. And, even many decades on, still wondering, did I do the right thing or not? So it was a period not just of kind of practical physical hardships and difficulties, over things like food and freedom and so on, but also these kind of morally grey areas that people kept wandering into without really intending to.
No, definitely. And the people are saying in the sidebar how much they appreciate this. And as we've said, it's not always about the big actions. It's about just this day to day. I'd never thought about if accepting a seat on a bus from a German, is that collaborating? I mean, it's on some kind of scale somewhere. It's on some sliding. Where do you put it? It really is fascinating. So yeah, we'll hand it back to you. It's just I'm loving it.
Well, the thing that did shock people, although it happened a fair amount, and I think is probably what was behind my friend whose grandmother caused a scandal in the family that never recovered, is what were called the jerry bags. Now, the jerry bags were the local women who ended up having an affair with the Germans. It's very hard, even 70, 80 years on. This was the one topic that people really froze up a little bit. I talked to them about the one topic that people were still angry about all these decades later. Everyone knew a jerry bag. Everyone could tell me, oh, there was a girl down the street who was a jerry bag. No one wanted to admit to being a jerry bag, even though I interviewed at least one person who I know had an affair with the German, because someone else told me, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to be doing a sort of Jeremy Kyle, kind of accusatory thing. But at the same time, I was sort of hoping she would talk about it, but she very much, didn't want to go there. So this is an interesting area where there were a lot of shame, because there was this sense that I think the idea at the time was that they were doing it to get more food. They were doing it to get presents. They were doing it they were kind of using it to benefit, to put themselves in a different category from the rest of the people, rather than simply falling in love. And there were probably a mixture of both, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think there were people who, they were in a desperate situation. If they could make friends with someone in a high place and it would make their life and their family's life easier, maybe they would do that. Other young girls who did genuinely just fall in love with a nice German guy who happened to be, living in their parents' house for years on end. It's kind of not surprising that these things would happen. Very rarely they ended up getting married and going the distance. And as I say, Werner Rang, the guy that I interviewed, the German guy, did settle down and marry his kind of wartime sweetheart. And that, was tricky, I think, for him after the war, this was actually in Sark, not in Guernsey. Sark is one of the smaller islands. I think it helped in his case. He was a medic, and in Sark, for complicated reasons, they basically had lost their doctor. So the German army ended up being responsible for the medical needs of the civilian population of Sark. So the German doctors, German medics were very popular there, because they were, they were who you would go and see. If you were sick, you'd go and see them and you'd get the medicine or whatever. So I think and also he was a very nice, polite young man, and very kind of respectful and so on. So he made a very good impression. Insofar as there were, people would say to me there were good Germans and there were bad Germans. He was very much in the kind of good German category. But one of the things I'd say that surprised me when I was doing the research is I think I was aware of the concept of the good German, but I had sort of always assumed that was the exception. Do you know what I mean? That yes, there might be, because I think when you think about fiction, even if you think about, say, the Guernsey Literary Potato Peel Pie Society novel and the movie, which was, I think, one of the things also that the movie hadn't come out when I was researching the book, but I'd read the book. That was sort of one of the things that had also got me kind of thinking about this subject and kind of set the frame to some extent of what I was expecting going in there, I suppose. This fictional story, that was another one where there's a good German doctor, but it's kind of, you sort of assume that's a rarity, that's the exception. Actually, most people I spoke to, it was the bad Germans who were the exceptions as far as they were concerned. They would say, most German officers, they would be polite, they would be respectful, they would be quite reasonable to deal with, but there were a few that you knew to watch out for. And the way they would put it is, there were the Germans and there were the Nazis, and you'd kind of quickly learn, who were the Nazis, and whether or not they were the ones who were, signed up National Socialists. Maybe that was the case, but for whatever reason, they were the ones who were the thugs. They were the ones who enjoyed having the power. They were the ones who were kind of more likely to abuse that power. But the vast majority of the Germans, as I say, they had a cushy posting. They were having a great time. They were sunbathing on the beaches. They were going out with the local girls if the local girls would go out with them. They were not really in a mood to cause trouble. So it was a kind of that was the norm. The norm, certainly in those early years, was that the German soldier would be polite, decent, respectful, hold the door open for you, you know, take an interest in your life, etc.
Right, cool.
That said, the occupation did create a lot of problems for people. There was an immediate food problem because the links to mainland Britain had been cut off. That had a massive impact on not just exports, but imports as well. People did struggle for food a lot, hence the potato peel pie society. Potato peel pie was a kind of occupation staple, which is basically what you make if you've got no meat, you've got no vegetables, you know, you've just got potatoes. You know, famously Jersey grows a lot of potatoes. It's a kind of pie, a potato pie with potatoes on the inside, potatoes on the outside, potatoes on the top. You know, that's kind of all you've got. A lot of people told me they would go gleaning in the fields, digging up like stumps of broccoli, anything they could find really, gathering carrageen moss from the beaches and boiling it up into this kind of, I think it's a kind of Irish blancmange. But a lot of people told me however much you tried to sweeten it, it always kind of tasted of salt water. Basically, it's kind of disgusting concoction. So people were struggling in a kind of, in various different ways. Schooling massively impacted. One woman told me her class at school, the Germans just kept, every time they found somewhere to teach them, the Germans would requisition it, because anywhere that was a good spot for a schoolroom was also good for, you know, I don't know, somewhere for kind of for the Germans, either as a sort of social venue or a kind of training venue or whatever. And also a lot of the teachers had been evacuated along with a lot of the kids. So the kids who had stayed behind, they were being taught by farmers, they were being taught by kind of random adults who often didn't really have any idea what they were doing. And where the Germans would come into the education system was in the German language lessons, which started off being voluntary and as time went on became compulsory. And that was another one of these kind of areas of sort of ambivalence, I suppose. Some kids quite enjoyed learning German. You know, they told me they found it really interesting and they were quite good at it. Others said that even, you know, at a young age, they were very much aware that it was kind of unpatriotic to learn German. One guy told me that it was a real sort of crisis in his class when this very beautiful young German woman came into the class, and all the boys had a crush on her basically, and she wore this blouse with little swastikas all over it. And he said she would give out apples to the kids who did the best in their German studies, and fruit was hard to come by, people were hungry, but he said basically, you know, if you got the apple, the rest of the class would kind of shun you at break time afterwards. So there were these kind of even for kids there was this awareness that there were these kind of dilemmas and these kind of issues. And there were these kind of moments of tension. There was the V sign campaign where people started chalking up, you know, V for victories, and this really pissed the Germans off. Basically, they didn't like it at all. There were these kind of moments of very minor level resistance or sort of civil disobedience, I suppose, almost, that always led to tension. They kind of increased the tension with the occupiers. There was, for example, a woman famously at a hotel who there was a Swiss, I think, chef who had anyway, one of the occupiers said Heil Hitler to her and expected her to respond with a Heil Hitler, and she responded to hell with Hitler for a rice pudding, this memorable phrase, which was enough to see her sent to prison in France for 6 months. She was unrepentant. She apparently spent her time embroidering Heil Churchill on her bed sheets and managed to smuggle them out with her. But so there were these kind of small moments of resistance, individuals who spoke out, who kind of objected, almost like kind of conscientious objectors in a sense to the occupation. And in some ways they gave people, they were a kind of boost to morale. In other ways they often led to a little bit of a clampdown, maybe not a kind of really brutal, they weren't shooting people in the street necessarily, but there would be, the curfew would get nudged up a bit.
And again, I'm assuming because of the closeness and of everybody living together, these little incidents are going to be heard by everybody very quickly. It's not, a farmer, I'm going to bring France into it, a farmer in the middle of Massif Central doing a V to a single German going across it. He's not going to reach cities 100 miles away, but in an island like Jersey or Guernsey, a little act of defiance in the street, everybody's going to know about it within almost minutes because of the network, and I mean both the locals and the occupiers as well. But I can see this trickle effect, as you refer to that kind of honeymoon period of the early time of the war, it gradually cranking up as the tensions on both sides just notch up a few levels. So no, really fascinating stuff.
The other thing, of course, that didn't help was, I mean, I think you're going to have someone talk about the commando raids.
Yeah.
Commando raids were not popular. And this was another reason that Churchill developed this kind of bit of an issue with the Channel Islands, particularly with Guernsey. So when they started launching the commando raids, Sherwill, who was this guy in Guernsey, was really annoyed about it. He was like, we're trying, you left this island, you took all the forces away, you declined to defend this island, you told us to get on with it, we've been getting on with the Germans, we've been trying to make the best of it, and now you're kind of sending people in and causing trouble and, essentially kind of putting a wedge between us and these Germans that we're trying to sort of manage this relationship with. So I suppose it was this very, there were these two different approaches. So his approach was very much, you sit down and have a drink with your German counterpart and try and work things out with them. Churchill, understandably, was very much of the idea, you send these guys in undercover and they cause mayhem and blow things up and so on. And, that's how you keep the war going in this situation. So it was this kind of ongoing tension, I suppose, this sort of unresolved tension for many years. The other thing, just since, as I say, my kind of angle or sort of approach, for want of a better word, is very much in the kind of the sort of social history side, the kind of ordinary people's experiences. One of the things that I talk to people a lot about, because everyone I interviewed 100 odd people, and everyone I spoke to, the last question I said to them was, what was the worst thing about the occupation? And I expected them to say the deportations, the occasional moments of brutality, lack of food, starvation, all these kind of things. Loads of people said boredom. That was the thing that they singled out. They were just cripplingly bored. They had these curfews. They couldn't go anywhere. Couldn't even travel between Guernsey and Jersey without like masses of paperwork and a really legitimate reason. Most people who lived in these islands, they were used to going to France. They were used to going to mainland Britain. You could get away. You weren't usually stuck on your island, basically, and certainly not for 5 years at a time. The cinema was a big source of entertainment for people, but obviously once the Germans arrived, there were no new films coming in. So the films that were in the islands were what happened to be playing, that week, essentially, and what was in circulation. They all got confiscated by the German censors. They went through them, weeded out a few that they thought were, unhelpful to their interests, and the rest sort of went back in circulation. But within a few weeks or months, everyone had seen everything essentially that was in English, and the only films that were coming in were German films, and the locals were allowed to go and see these films. They were kind of German propaganda pieces. You can see in the picture on the right, Sieg im Westen, Victory in the West, which was one of these films that everyone ended up seeing. But people I spoke to, they said, you'd go once or twice out of curiosity, and they put a barrier down the middle of the cinema. So the Germans would sit on one side and the locals on the other. But apparently the German side was always packed and the local side was quite poorly attended, because basically after a while you'd realize it's quite depressing sitting through these German propaganda films and seeing how they think they're going to conquer the world, and everyone else is going to kind of fall down.
I guess it's going to reinforce how distant you feel, because
yeah,
I have a slight bit of connection in the sense that as an expat not living in Britain, even though when I couldn't go to Britain during lockdown, even if I wasn't planning to go, it was annoying that I couldn't go. When you're, and I imagine if you've been living on Jersey, the fact even if you weren't traveling, the fact you could travel, the idea that you can go and do stuff, and when that's taken away from you, I guess those people would have never felt more isolated, even though they chose, they like living there. It's their ancestry. They've been there for generations, but the connection with the mainland has been taken away from you. So and then there's German films playing in your cinema. It must have been a very isolating, forgotten by the world scenario.
Yeah, and I think that's how a lot of the Channel Islanders felt. Certainly, they felt, when the British demilitarized, they felt abandoned. This is why I say Churchill is quite a divisive figure there. And in that instance, Churchill didn't want to abandon the islands. He wanted to fight for them. Everyone else said, no, that's crazy. And in the end, kind of, in a, you know, surprising act of kind of discretion being the better part of valor, he kind of said, all right, fine, we, you know, we'll leave these. This is not worth fighting for, not worth losing the war over these islands. But yeah, there was very much this feeling they'd been abandoned. It happened again in a massive way after D-Day. I mean, lots of people told me, you know, that everyone knew D-Day was coming. The radios had been confiscated by this point, but a lot of people had secret radios. They were kind of listening into stuff. They could hear the forces landing. They could hear the explosions on the coast of France. And everyone in the islands expected that, you know, once D-Day happened, they would be liberated, because they were literally on the way. You know, if you're going to get to Normandy, you have to go past these islands. And there was this real sense of letdown when, you know, a day, 2 days, 3 days went by and nothing changed. And the Germans had been expecting it too. They were all, you know, up on their Atlantic wall, kind of ready for a massive fight. But there was no fight, because the islands were so massively over fortified, the amount of kind of resources that it would have taken to capture them, and it would have been a bloodbath. You know, they were packed with civilians. It would have been a terrible idea, basically, to go and fight for the islands. So the idea was, you know, they're not doing much militarily. They're of no value. They're no strategic value, really. So we'll just ignore them. And when the war's over, we can come in and liberate them then. But for the people who lived there, again, there was this massive sense that we've literally been forgotten. You know, have they forgotten that we're here even? And the fact that there was this kind of news blackout almost as well on the BBC, you know, they didn't really talk about the Channel Islands. They didn't want to talk about the occupation. It was considered bad for morale to admit that these British territories were in German hands. So they did very much have that sense of kind of abandonment, of being cut off. Just in terms of the boredom, so I talked a bit about the cinema. They had a term for it. They called it the mental blackout of occupation, basically this kind of crippling boredom. One thing that I was not expecting when I went and started this research was to discover that amateur dramatics had an absolute explosion of popularity in these years, because there was nothing to do at the cinemas. A lot of the cinemas ended up turning into kind of theatres, and they put a lot of theatre shows on. And there were these variety companies in particular that people put a huge amount of effort into, and everyone, it seems, was involved. Something like, I think it's like about 2% of the population of Guernsey were performing in an Amdram show at one point. Wow. You know, I mean, like, well, I guess, you know, it's only a small percentage, but at the same time, it's a lot of people treading the boards. Even the wife of Ambrose Sherwell, the Attorney General, was on stage in some kind of frothy comedy. And so I talked to this woman who, she and her sister were headhunted for the Lyric Theatre. This is one of their programs, for their variety program. She told me all about the variety acts they put together. The guy who ran it, a guy called Eric Snelling, was headhunting the best performers. He spotted them at a sing-along, you know, on the far side, it's kind of rural side of the island, and came round the next morning and knocked on the door and basically said, I want you in my show. So, you know, they were singing and dancing and putting a lot of effort into these performances. And for the local people who would attend these shows, you know, week in, week out, they were a massive, they were probably the biggest boost to morale. Basically, this sense that, you know, there was something worth living for almost. They were, you know, there was something new to see every week. So they were incredibly popular. This was a show, one of their most popular shows was called Café Continental, set in a kind of Parisian street cafe. They had another one set in the Wild West called Texas Trail. They had one called Anchors Away, set on a cruise ship. And so they do these kind of variety skits with this kind of unifying theme, and everyone would source their own costumes and props and so on.
And I assume there's a possibility as well for a bit of satire, a bit of, yeah, because the even if the Germans were able to understand English, there's a lot you can do with intonation and tone. And you know, we look at it with situations in current times of countries with regimes. Satire can often go kind of unseen by the authorities because it's subtle. So I imagine there were occasions where because obviously the Germans have to approve the productions put on, but there's still things you could put little digs in, little bits of satirical jokes that the audience would have a kind of knowing nod about. There's clearly a kind of a laughing at Hitler or laughing at authorities. So that must have been a real boost to people's confidence as well.
They had to be very careful. I mean, basically, so the woman who I interviewed, who was in one of these variety shows, she was called Daphne, and they would write their own sketches. That she said they were very careful not to be too political. They would have songs about the black market. They'd have songs about, you know, so they would touch on contemporary issues, but they were they couldn't be too biting, let's say, because every show, the dress rehearsal would be the dress rehearsal for all the performers, and it would be the first time they saw what their fellow, because the way it worked, you'd be it might be you and a partner, or you might be doing a song on your own, or you might, you wouldn't necessarily know what everyone else was performing in the variety show until the dress rehearsal, when it all comes together. But it was also when the German censor sat there with his clipboard, and she said it was always a very strange performance because he was this very humorless man who would kind of sit there nodding to say that he understood what was being said, but with no, totally kind of stony faced. So she said they had to be very careful. But there was one instance that she told me about, an extraordinary time when in 1942, one of the kind of real turning points in the occupation, when the cracks kind of started to show in that idea of the model occupation, was this decision that was taken by Hitler to deport the British-born islanders. So the people in the islands, they were a mixture of people who'd lived there for generations, and then they were very popular, particularly like retirement destinations. A lot of people would go there in their retirement, or just British people go and decide to go and live there because these gorgeous islands. So there was quite a high proportion of people living in the islands who'd not been born there, but who'd been born in mainland Britain. And what the Germans decided to try and do was to sort of drive a wedge between these two communities. They sort of felt the Channel Islanders who'd lived there for generations were less loyal to Britain, essentially, than the ones who'd grown up in Britain. And so they thought if they removed the British-born ones, the others would kind of just fall into line a bit more. What they didn't count on was that actually the locals who had been there for generations, these were their neighbors, these were their friends. They were horrified at the idea that they were being rounded up and deported and put on these boats, and actually it made things much harder for the Germans, because it was one of the few things that people really reacted against. They couldn't, there were no riots, there were no there wasn't a kind of the response was quite muted in that sense, but people did go out on the streets. They kind of quietly paid a sort of respect to the people who were being deported. They showed that they cared about them, that they were not just going to ignore this. They were not going to kind of pretend it wasn't happening. And one of the most extraordinary stories that I heard about this variety group was there was a guy, the baritone was a guy called Doug Lucky. That was his surname, Douglas Lucky. And he'd been born in Guernsey, so he was allowed to stay, but his parents had been born in Britain, so they were deported. And on the day that they were loaded onto the boats and sent off over to Germany to go into these deportation camps, he was down to sing the final number in the variety show, and the final number was a song called Absent Friends. And this woman Daphne said he was this huge, 6'6", big tough guy, big deep voice, but he was completely emotionally overwhelmed by the experience. And he was singing this song about absent friends, and she said he could barely get through it. His voice was cracking. Everyone was wasn't sure he was going to make it. And at the end of the song, they were in their French Parisian cafe set up, and he had a glass of wine in his hand. He raised his glass in the air and he said, "The toast is absent friends." And then she said, from the very back of the auditorium, someone shouted out, "Don't worry, Doug, they'll be back again soon." And the entire auditorium just went nuts. They were clapping, they were cheering, they were stamping their feet. There was this kind of riotous atmosphere because they touched on this very intense experience that no one could really talk about. The Germans were totally baffled. They didn't really understand what was going on, but people were shouting, "Encore, encore." Suddenly the audience had come alive. And she said this guy was just in floods of tears by this point, but the rest of the cast all stepped forward and sang the song again. And it was just this electric moment, because it was it was a form of resistance in a sense, without anyone doing anything really. But everyone in that theatre had this sense of solidarity. Everyone knew what everyone else was thinking. They were all upset, they were all angry, and they might not be able to do anything about it, but they could kind of share in that experience. But then, they did their encore, they got to the end, the house lights came up, everyone went home, made sure they were back in bed by curfew, and things kind of carried on. So it was this weird experience of, in the midst of this very organized, quite repressive regime, in a sense, a little chink resistance almost.
If not resistance, certainly unity, certainly
defiance.
Exactly what the ideas the Germans were doing was to try and split the population. And in fact, all it does is unite them. I'm reminded of in France of the order to send off so many males for the service travail obligataire actually is what united people. Hang on, I don't want to go and waste the Germans. And that's when lots of young people went and joined the resistance. Sometimes there's something the Germans did that was almost benign or had an intention actually made things worse. The opposite reaction happened, is that you create a unity through something they thought would break people. So it's fascinating as that, the occupation obviously had its various phases as the war, because it was a long occupation, and it was obviously different at the end than it was at the start. But anyway, I'm loving it, and I'll let you hand it back to move on through your slides. It's just amazing show.
So this is just the notice of the deportations. So you can see published in German and English. People got used to these notices published in 2 languages. This is Ambrose Sherwill, who coined this idea of the model occupation. As I say, quite a divisive figure. Now, these are the slave workers, who, as I say, if you've heard a little bit about the Atlantic Wall, this was this massive fortification program, and it was built largely through slave labor. People had been captured on the Eastern Front, a lot of Russians and other nationalities as well. And they were treated really appallingly badly. They were not under the kind of, I was going to say care, that's not the right word. They were not being managed by the German military. They were managed by this civilian Organisation Tot, which was much more, I think, inclined, certainly in the local parlance of the Germans and the Nazis, it was much more of a Nazi organisation rather than a German organisation. And they were treated really brutally. They were not fed. I mean, in Alderney, I don't go into this a huge amount in my book, partly because there's no one to, or I certainly didn't find anyone to interview who experienced this, because Alderney basically was pretty much entirely evacuated by the local people. And so the Germans had free reign there. And a lot of the worst atrocities of the occupation took place in Alderney, where there were these camps and the horrific stories of brutalization, but not much involving the local population. I mean, I think, obviously, with the camps, with the Holocaust, there's a sort of debate of, did people know what was going on? I think genuinely in Alderney, most people in the Channel Islands probably didn't know what was going on. Well, they might have heard a rumor, but there's no one's seeing it, if you know what I mean, because it's on another island across the sea. So it was kind of the secret, the dark side of the occupation. But what a lot of people did see was the treatment of these slave workers, being whipped, being starved, being brutalized. And it shocked a lot of people. And, most people I interviewed told me how sorry they felt for them. One thing that did strike me, though, talking about this question, and, you were asking what kind of a historian am I, what kind of a writer am I? And the answer is that I rely largely on first-person testimony. I interview people. I interviewed 100 odd people for this book, but I did also go back and look at memoirs and diaries and contemporary sources. And one of the things that I thought was quite a useful lesson to bear in mind is I would say pretty much every one of those 100 odd people I interviewed told me how sorry they felt for these slave workers. A lot of them told me they would try to smuggle food for them. Some of them told me they would try and hide them, or their families would hide them. When I looked at diaries from the time, there were people who were saying things like that, like, oh, it's so awful the way they treat them. There were also people saying things like, oh, the scum of the earth have arrived on the islands. Who are these filthy people? The Germans have brought the dregs of society. We don't trust them. They're stealing from us at night, because they would escape at night. The Germans kind of deliberately let them out at night, basically, so they could go and try and find food, so they didn't have to feed them. So I just thought that was a really interesting reminder that it's one of the limitations, I suppose, of oral history, or of that kind of history, is that there is a kind of accepted narrative, and deliberately or not, people will play into that. And you won't hear, there are certain attitudes at the time that you won't hear, 70, 80 years on, because they wouldn't sort of be acceptable now. So that was an interesting element, I think. This is one of the most remarkable stories. The guy on the right is this guy, Bob Le Sueur, who I mentioned. I don't know if anyone has seen, there's a movie called Another Mother's Son, which is the story of Bob and this lady on the top, Louisa Gould. And the guy on the bottom left, his ID card identifies him as Oscar Lebray. it's a Jersey pronunciation. Le Bray is how you pronounce it. That's not Oscar Le Bray. Oscar Le Bray was a Jerseyman, but he had given up his ID card. The people who were involved in this kind of resistance network would lose their ID cards, get a replacement made, and then effectively be able to donate the original to, in this case, an escaped Russian slave worker. And this guy, this Russian, he had been initially sheltered by Louisa Gould, who had lost her own son in the war. He'd been serving, I think he'd been serving in the Air Force. Anyway, he died. And so this young Russian guy turned up, and she said, I had to do something for another mother's son, which is where the title of the film came from. This is what she said to Bob. Bob was working as an insurance agent, so he was traveling around the island. And so he kind of encountered her because she'd put in an insurance claim, and he arrived at her house, and there was this guy who I think she claimed was a friend visiting from France or something. And he was like, this guy clearly has a Russian accent. This story is bogus. And essentially, when Louisa Gould was informed on by some of her neighbours, she was taken away. She was sent to a concentration camp and killed. And Bob ended up being the one responsible for this Russian. And he hid him at the insurance office, and then he placed him with a pair of conscientious objectors living in St. Helier. And so he lived basically in the capital city of Jersey with these two guys undercover. And with this fake ID, they'd sourced him a pair of plain glasses and a trilby hat and a trench coat from the local Amdram Society again. So they'd given him this kind of disguise, and he was going out and about in St. Helier for years during the occupation under the noses of the Germans with this kind of fake identity. So he was one of these the most striking stories really of the lengths that the local people would go to help these Russians and other nationalities. And obviously Bob survived. He's still alive and kicking at 101. Louisa Gould wasn't so lucky. She got found out, and she kind of suffered the ultimate fate. I mean, it was very unusual. There were these deportations, as I say, to camps. Yep. They were treated generally fairly well. There were people who were punished for various crimes and sent to prisons in France for a period of time. But the stuff that happened to her, I think Julie Carr's going to talk a bit more about some of these kind of the worst case scenarios, in a sense, which did happen. They weren't that common, but they did happen. And there's an example of a woman who suffered the worst possible fate. Similarly, someone was asking a while back, I noticed, about Jews. I mean, the story of the Jews in the Channel Islands, also a really shocking story and a very complicated story. We might not have time to go into all the kind of ramifications of, but the short answer is most Jews evacuated during the early period before the Germans arrived, because that was kind of a no-brainer. Some weren't able to for various reasons. There were some, very unfortunately, who'd actually been arrested because they were Jews who'd come from, there was a woman who I think had come from Vienna, and so she would, because she was an Austrian, she was under sort of investigation at the time and wasn't able to leave. And there were a handful who ended up dying as a result, being sent off to the camps and dying. There were also instances of Jews who were hidden, particularly in Jersey. There was an osteopath, for example. And in fact, Bob told me this quite funny story. So there was this guy who was this local osteopath who treated all the Germans. And Bob said, for some reason, someone had said, oh, we think he's sympathetic to the cause or whatever. And he was looking for somewhere to hide one of these Russians. And he went to see this guy and said, look, I don't suppose you've got anywhere you could put one of these guys. I'm looking for a place for them. And he said the osteopath exploded at him, was like, how dare you? What do you mean to suggest this nonsense? Get out of my sight, never speak to me again, sort of thing. And it was only after the war he discovered the osteopath was already sheltering like half a dozen Jews in his basement. And it was like he didn't want to, he was sort of putting up this front of kind of like nothing to do with me, because I suppose he wouldn't know whether to trust Bob or not. People had to be incredibly careful. But there were these people, particularly, more so in Jersey, particularly there were these people who were involved in this kind of, as I say, humanitarian kind of resistance. Right, this is it's jumping back. I mentioned D-Day. This was on D-Day. They put up this proclamation saying, Germany's enemies on the point of attacking French soil. We urge you to keep your head. And then so to talk about that kind of latter period of the war. So I So I mentioned the locals felt quite abandoned. They felt quite. There were a lot of difficult emotions following D-Day. It was also, practically speaking, the most difficult period of the occupation by far, because having been cut off from mainland Britain, they'd been relying on food coming in from France, and then now they were cut off on both sides, basically. So the islands were effectively under siege. And this was one reason that the Allies didn't come and try to take them militarily, was they basically thought they could kind of effectively starve them out. And famously, there's a memo where Churchill wrote, he scrawled in handwriting on the bottom, "Let them starve." And obviously he was thinking of the Germans, but I think to the local people, there was this sense of that there was a kind of indifference to the fact that the locals were starving as well. Malnutrition became a serious problem. People were literally dying of starvation. And it wasn't till Christmas 1944 that aid started to arrive, thanks to the Red Cross. So what you can see in the pictures here, people started receiving these boxes, and they would be full of, not just food, but actually quite amazing, chocolate, tea and coffee, things they hadn't had for years. Amazing, a kind of bounty of food. I mean, everyone I talked to said they just couldn't believe it when kids, were tasting things they'd never had before, basically, from these boxes. You can see here a list of some of the stuff they all came from New Zealand or Canada. So here you go, you've got Canadian chocolate, marmalade, corned beef, salmon, butter, tea, coffee, etc. So quite a treat, really, in these aid parcels. And they really made the difference for the local people for that last kind of stretch of the war, the tail end of 1944 going into 1945. One man apparently was so excited when he received his parcel that he ate the whole thing in one go and promptly died of gorging. Most people were a bit more sensible and managed to kind of eke them out. But either way, they made the huge difference. But then, of course, what happened was the local people were receiving these aid parcels, and the Germans were the ones who were receiving nothing. And now it was the Germans who were going out gleaning. Now it was the Germans who were, in some cases, catching people's pets. I mean, I spoke to a woman who said her cat went missing, and they were looking everywhere for the cat, and then they saw the cat's skin hanging out on a German line, and the cat had been eaten. They were shooting seagulls. They were really going to desperate measures. Werner, who I spoke to, the German guy, said he and some friends went out. They built themselves a raft, and they went out on the raft to try and catch fish. And they caught some fish using explosives, I think. It was a bit of a mad idea. And then they got back, and their supervisor, their officer kind of saw them coming up the beach and confiscated all the fish, and they all got in trouble. So it was like a terrible waste of energy, basically. Wow. But so the Germans were really struggling.
And that, I have to say that earlier on the sidebar, it was the fact that the occupation continued till the day after VE Day is most surprised the people, my viewers from the US and Australia, who are perhaps a little bit less familiar with the story. They were most surprised by that. And again, referencing the kind of the similarities to UK and the similarities to the French occupation is that I found that last year probably the most intriguing part of the story, because by the UK itself, mainland UK, by the middle of 44, things are kind of running at peak in terms of the Women's Land Army is working, the Timber Corps, all the farming is working, the Battle of the Atlantic is kind of not over, but it's winding down. So I'm not saying there's prosperity and spare food in 44, but the worst is definitely over. But for the people on the Channel Islands, the 1940 period, when you could argue the people on the mainland were going through the worst, that was maybe the honeymoon period for the Channel Islands. And they're now 4 years later, they're experiencing their desperate times. Although, as people have said, thankfully the Red Cross was stepping in. But that last year is, I think, the most fascinating period.
Yeah, it's certainly the period. I mean, I think for me, the Red Cross parcels are fascinating because they're this point where the tables turn. Suddenly the Germans are the ones who are in the desperate situation, and it's like, okay, they haven't lost the war yet, but they've kind of they've lost all the cards somehow. For years there was this sense of, like the jerry bags. You've got a German officer for a boyfriend, you're going to get everything. They've got all the advantages. They get all the reservations at the restaurants. They kind of get everything. Now suddenly it's the other way around, and they're the ones struggling. And the locals. Someone I spoke to told me that there was a bar of chocolate they got in their parcel, and they taunted the Germans by like eating it in front of them and kind of really making a meal of it and kind of saying, look what we've got. And actually I saw someone was asking in the comments, did the troops take the food? They actually were very good. They were very good on the kind of discipline of, no, these are for the civilians, we're not allowed to have that. I mean, there was some of that went on, but for the most part they were actually that was surprisingly well handled. The discipline was good.
But I guess the Germans now know, you made the point yourself a minute ago, is they kind of know the writing is on the wall now. I'm going to make a really naff analogy, but it's like that last half an hour of a Monopoly game when you know who's going to win now, but you've got to go through those last rounds of handing over your last bit. So the Germans there now, particularly those that had a better than average relationship now, they're not going to, blot their own copybook now by getting all boisterous at the end and to stealing food, because it's not in their own interest to, because unless the invasion happens, which we know didn't happen, they're just biding their time now, waiting for whatever conclusion is going to come their way. So I can understand why the Germans didn't do anything too bad at that period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, certainly Werner said to me, yeah, that was his idea, was, we knew the game was up. We were not going to win this war. It was just a matter of time. Unfortunately for them, having always had these, I talked a bit about the sort of civilian authorities on the local side. The Germans in the Channel Islands generally as well were quite moderate. They were not, big Nazis. A lot of them were quite, looked down their nose. They tended to be kind of German aristocrats. They looked down their noses a bit at Hitler. They also were quite reasonable, quite laid back. They were into this kind of quite soft, this idea of this kind of soft occupation. Unfortunately, what happened after D-Day was that there was a German admiral, Admiral Hofmeier, who ended up being sort of caught. I think he was sort of caught behind the lines and ended up kind of retreating to the Channel Islands. And then he found himself in charge. So he became the new commandant, and he was a real hardline Nazi and a real kind of diehard and absolutely determined to fight to the last man. So Werner, for example, I talked to, he said he went to a rally. Hofmeier, after he took over, started organizing these rallies. And insofar as, for the most part, the occupation, there hadn't been swastikas everywhere. There hadn't been a lot of kind of the paraphernalia. There hadn't, as I said, it had been, I mean, it was still an occupation, but it wasn't quite what you might imagine, if you know what I mean. And it wasn't like the occupations in France or elsewhere in Europe, really. It was a kind of softer version of that. Now this guy comes in, and it's the rallies with the floodlights and the full orchestra and the kind of swastikas everywhere and banners and all this stuff. And Werner said, basically, you had to go, everyone was there, we all had to do the Hitler salute. And, there's hundreds of people in this room thinking, this is all over, this is ridiculous. What's going? It's kind of the emperor has no clothes, but no one dares to challenge this guy because he's the guy in charge, and they had to follow him to the bitter end. And it's Hofmeier who really makes that last period, sort of strings it out as long as possible, to the extent that famously on VE Day, Churchill had this line, and our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today. Well, in fact, they weren't. They were supposed to be freed on VE Day. What happened was the British liberation troops arrived, and they were just off the sort of territorial waters. Hofmeier sent a message saying, if you come within my waters a minute before midnight, I'm going to shoot your boats. I'm going to sink your boats, basically, because yes, we've lost, but I'm not giving up this island one moment earlier than I have to. And there was a guy called Brigadier Snow on the British side was so incensed by this, he sent a message back saying, if you dare fire on one of my ships, I'll personally see you hanged tomorrow morning in the town square. But the fact is, they knew this guy was a fanatic. They knew he was a bit of a maniac. No one really wanted to see. They didn't want to call his bluff and see whether he was really willing to start a fight on the eve of of liberation after the war had ended. Basically, after Germany surrendered after VE Day. So they went away and they came back the next day, which is why the Channel Islands were liberated a day late. Basically, it was all down to this crazy admiral who'd kind of taken over at the last minute.
Crazy admiral is a very good summary there. But it's true that last bit, that last chapter, that twist in the story, is really extraordinary.
Liberation Day, these are just a few photos. I mean, I said everyone had memories of the raid at the start of the war. Everyone had stories to tell about Liberation Day. I mean, if you think VE Day was a big party, this was like the party to end all parties. And these are small islands. Literally everyone was out in town greeting the Tommies as they were arriving, making them cups of tea, making them food, whatever they had food from their parcels, I guess, giving them stuff. It was the kind of ultimate celebration, and people found different ways to mark it. One woman I spoke to, she said she went to a Liberation Day dance and she'd been dancing for hours and hours and hours, and she suddenly realized, oh, there's no curfew, we don't have to go home, we can just keep going. And she said she literally danced through to the following morning and her feet were bleeding by the end of it, but she couldn't stop dancing because she was so happy and excited. Another woman told me that she and her husband went into town, then went home and conceived a Liberation Day baby. There was a kind of little baby boom locally in the islands.
Fantastic.
Because a lot of people celebrated the same way. So various people found different ways of kind of celebrating. But one of the most poignant stories that I heard actually was a guy in Jersey, a guy called Alec, who I asked him what it had been like, what his memories of Liberation Day were. And he said he just went into town, he stood there and he watched the Tommies coming in and he just wept. And he said basically he was weeping for the 5 years of occupation, but of him, it wasn't so much the kind of external things. Because I asked him, what was the worst thing about the occupation, and he said it wasn't the practical things, it wasn't the curfews, it wasn't all these kind of practical things. It was this sense of just never being able to be yourself. He said he never felt he could say anything without second guessing himself. Was someone listening? Was he saying the wrong thing? Was he going to get himself in trouble? And it was just this massive release for him of being able to just feel he could be himself, and that was enough. And he was, allowed to exist somehow, and he didn't have to worry. And that was the biggest difference to him. And as he was telling me this story, 70 odd years on, and there were tears pouring down his face telling it again. So that kind of, I think, just really gave me this insight. Yes, it was this big party, it's this big celebration, but it was also just this enormous relief and release, really, that this ordeal that these 70,000 people had gone through had finally come to an end.
Well, brilliant. And we just had a question, although Nick has already kind of half answered it, but it was asked, were there any revenge campaigns against the jerry bags like in France and Holland? So we're talking about the shaved heads and things like that. And Nick's given a response, but I'm intrigued by yours.
Yeah, what did Nick say? I'd be interested.
He said not spurning rather than violence is basically what he said.
I'd say that's true. I mean, I think not quite on the same level as maybe we're familiar with. At the same time, it did happen. I mean, I interviewed a guy. I was quite shocked by this, but I mentioned that the jerry bags was the one subject that people that was an issue, even many decades on. There was a definite kind of frisson around that. And one guy I interviewed, he told me he went and tarred and feathered a jerry bag, and I was like, he could obviously see from my face, I was like shocked that he was telling me this. And first of all, he was like, well, she deserved it, as far as and as far as he was concerned, she still deserved it. Do you know what I mean? He wasn't saying I shouldn't have done it. He was saying, yeah, fair enough, that's what I did. And so he could see this look on my face, and he said, it wasn't hot tar, it wasn't kind of, it was like, we didn't hurt her, we just, humiliated her basically, and tormented her. So yeah, I mean, there was a degree of that, not to the extent and the kind of violence and the brutality maybe that we have heard from other places, but yeah, it did happen. And in different ways, people were shunned and people were punished. And I would say that the thing that I would say about the jerry bags is I think they stood in for a lot of other issues to do with collaborators.
That's the story, and it's
all this kind of stuff.
It was a way of release, wasn't it? It was a way of focusing. You can see it on the faces in the French newsreels of the men doing the shaving, that they're punishing themselves for their own lack of resistance, whether it was they're taking out. That indeed is a subject for an entire show on World War II TV. That treatment of women who had slept with Germans for various reasons in occupied Europe would make a week of shows on that, but. You've got your books up there on screen there. We're going to have a question about what you're working on next, but my last one is again probably a little bit of a complicated one to answer, but again, living in France, you know, you're going for the next 10, 20 years. There's that the who was in the resistance, who wasn't in resistance. What was, you know, as life went back to normal in the next few years, I mean, there wasn't the rebuilding to do there as such, because there hadn't been the destruction there. But was there a period of trust having to be restored among the people, the population of those who've been away, those who came back? Because obviously we didn't talk about the fact that some people from the Channel Islands had served their country because they'd left early, they'd been serving in the forces, coming back. Was there a period of healing generally on the island or the islands where people had to kind of learn to trust again?
Yeah, it was a very difficult period, actually. I think those early years after the war, as the evacuees came back, they were quite shocked. I mean, you know, that they found their islands in some ways were unrecognizable. Some of their houses had been destroyed. Their property was gone. There were these bunkers everywhere. But also on the kind of personal level, there was this real mistrust, I think, kind of going both ways to some extent. I mean, I think for a lot of the islanders who'd, you know, faced starvation, who'd really feared that they were not going to make it, there was this sense that the evacuees had kind of escaped all of that, you know, that they had kind of run away and they hadn't lived through this traumatic, very difficult, defining experience. For those who went away, there was this kind of suspicion that everyone who had stayed behind was a collaborator, was a fraternizer, had done, you know, things they shouldn't have done. So there was this real kind of rift in society, I think, that took a long time to heal. And in some ways, probably, you know, in certain situations, probably never healed. And even just on a kind of domestic level, I mean, I spoke to a guy who, within his family, and this was quite common, that some members of the family would evacuate and others would, you know, just as, you know, with the evacuations from the cities in Britain, you know, it wouldn't be the whole family that would evacuate. Often people end up seeing their brothers and sisters for years. Well, in this case, it was literally 5 years. And he said, you know, he just felt like he didn't really know his family came back and they were strangers to him. And he felt he didn't have a family anymore. And he said, you know, he sort of tried to kind of reintegrate with them. But in the end, he felt totally kind of displaced. So just this experience, this amount of time in his life as a young person, you know, 5 years for a young person is a big chunk of time.
Yeah, I was going to make that point. 5 years for an adult is very different to 5. If you leave at 10 and come back at 15, or, you know, you're different. You're an adult. You gone a child, come back an adult.
Exactly.
Or younger, you've gone as a baby, come back as a talking human being, to a sense. So massively different. Well, just the one, Rob Crane asked about Werner, the German you interviewed, who met when he returned. When did he return, and what kind of reaction did he get?
So what happened to him was, so the Germans in the islands, they were, after the war, they were put in kind of internment camps in Britain. So he was loaded onto, so part of the whole kind of liberation experience, the Tommies came, they turned up, and then these ships arrived to take the Germans away, and they all filed into these ships and were taken, and he ended up in a camp, I can't remember where, like in Kent or somewhere, for a few years, you know, because they were there for a long time. And in that period, he started writing to this girl, Phyllis, who he had fallen in love with. Now, because I interviewed both of them, she was adamant that she was not, you know, she wasn't a jerryback. She was not romantically interested in him during the war. They were just friends. They were good friends, but, you know, there was no hint of romance. He said basically it was love at first sight and he was besotted with her. But it wasn't until after the war had ended, he started writing to her from his camp. And they wrote, you know, they showed me these kind of stacks of beautiful romantic letters that he'd written her and she'd written back. And so they had this kind of correspondence, romance, after the war was over, while he was in the camp. And then she went over and visited him a couple of times, and he was allowed out of the camp to go. She took him on a trip to London, for example, and they sort of went and saw the sights together. And then it got to the point where he was going to be sent home. And he was, I think, from the part of Germany that he was from was under Russian control, and he really didn't want to go back there. He also was in love with this girl. So anyway, he ended up proposing to her, and she agreed to marry him, and they got married. And he moved to Sark, where they lived, the two of them, for the rest of their lives. And they, sadly, they both passed away since I interviewed them. I mean, they were both very elderly at the time that I was researching the book, but they lived there for the rest of their lives. And as I say, you know, he, I think, had fallen head over heels for this girl, but also just fallen head over heels for this stunning, beautiful island. he called it eine kleine Paradise, a little paradise, and he spent the rest of his life there. So for him, it was, the occupation was the best thing that ever happened, really. He got sent to this, gorgeous, beautiful island, fell in love with the love of his life, and never left.
Which is a great way to end it, in that we started with this idea about the occupation being different for everybody. So the German occupiers had different experiences. The islanders had different experiences. Those that were evacuated and came back had a different experience again. And it being a very complex issue, as occupation always is. The nuance, the interest is in the nuance. It's not black and white. There's somewhere a way between resistance and collaboration. It's just that survival and dealing with each day as it goes past. But anyway, we'll bring things to an end now. So I'll just folks, Nick is coming on tomorrow to talk about the commando raids, and then I think we have an Arnhem show rescheduled for Friday, and then Gilly is on Monday. Dr. Gilly Carr, that is, and Eric Lee is coming on also on Monday in the evening. So that's what's coming up in Channel Islands at Warwick. Duncan, it's been incredible. My final question: someone asked, "What are you working on now?" or if there's anything World War II in the pipeline.
What I'm working on right now is not World War II. It's a book that's more kind of going into the 60s and 70s. You were talking about this kind of dilemma, for me as someone who writes about the war and interviews people, of the dwindling numbers of people to interview. I kind of approached that problem in two ways. So the book I'm working on at the moment is kind of moving forward in time. I really wanted to do one more World War II book before it's too late. So the idea I came up with, actually partly off the back of doing this Channel Islands book and speaking to a lot of people who were kids during the war, is after I finish that one, I'm going to be doing a book about kids' experiences of the Blitz, because it kind of buys you, from the kind of oral history point of view, it buys you that extra, number of years to speak to people who experienced the war, but as kids, not as adults. And I think in some ways kids have interesting perspectives. I mean, even with the occupation, I found that, say the food issue. So anyone who was an adult during the occupation would talk about how tough it was to get enough food, how people were starving. People who were kids, they weren't that aware of it at the time. And all I can think is their parents must have given them whatever food they had went to the kids. So the kids almost didn't know how bad it was. So I think it's really interesting, to see things through a child's eyes as opposed to an adult's eyes.
Yeah.
So I'm looking
and the fact they came out healthier, that was that weird thing. When you look at the medical reports after war, those, we think of rationing as being so doom and gloom, but actually the diet they were eating was healthy. It wasn't. We had chicken nuggets and McDonald's back then, but the fact is they are eating an insane amount of vegetables and fresh food and seafood and good ingredients. It's not, yes, there's the spam and corned beef as well, but that childhood experience was actually of a healthier lifestyle, more air. Those that evacuated the country, another fascinating experience there. I mean, we can go going down a whole rabbit hole again, but the evacuees I knew, they look back on the war incredibly fondly, a lot of them, because it was the best part of them. Michael Caine, the actor, talks about when he was evacuated. That was one of the best parts, because he grew up in Elephant and Castle in London, and there he is suddenly in the countryside eating fresh vegetables. It was a paradise, and yes, he missed his parents. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole. But Duncan, it's been absolutely thrilling talking to you. I'd love to have you come back on again.
Talk to you about. It might be a few years, but I'll come back and talk to you about that one.
Brilliant. Well, anyway, folks, this has been another cracking show of World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow night for the Commando raids. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Duncan, and thanks for watching. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.